When it comes to strength training for cycling, many of us tend to think of the barbell back squat as being the ultimate exercise. But in fact, there are a number of different squat variations that you can do with the barbell that will help you see performance gains and improvement in how you're moving. But you've got to understand the why behind each. Today, I'm going to show you 5 different squat variations with the barbell that many of you may not even know. 2 of them you're probably familiar with, most likely familiar with, but the other 3 are going to give you options to help you to choose the best possible exercise to help you get fitter, faster, and stronger, and not just stronger in the gym. So if you're ready to take your performance to a new level and to learn some new exercises that can really help you pinpoint your weaknesses, let's get started. First of the barbells that we look at, the Zercher squat is one where we're actually holding the barbell in the crooks of our arms. Now, when you're doing this, it can be really uncomfortable in the crook of the arm. It's best to use a bar pad if you have one like they have for the hip thruster. I just usually take a towel or my sweatshirt and I'll wrap it around the bar. But there are some very, very important particular technique details that you have to get right in order to get what you want out of this. Number one is when you're taking the bar, we want to make sure that you're having both hands even. So I've seen people where they have one out to the side and one in, or they take it where the hands are crossed, and that's not what we want. Part of the key takeaway for the Zercher squat is it's a regression essentially of the front squat, in that it allows you to keep the bar closer to your center of gravity because you're keeping it in the crook of the arm instead of up on the front of the torso, or a back squat on the back of the torso. The second is it starts to get you to get scapulothoracic control. And this is really important for cyclists and triathletes. We've got to teach you how to reach from the shoulder using the serratus anterior while the mid and lower traps are stabilizing on the back. There's a whole bunch of other muscles, but that's the introduction to it. And we want to be able to reach from both shoulders and keep our hands nice and locked in. So what this is doing is getting you to use your obliques, your rectus abdominis, your transverse abdominis. All of the core muscles, everything between your neck, elbows, and knees has to be stiff to move well. It also allows you to properly load the hips. So let's take a look at a repetition. So again, with the bar itself, it's not going to be super comfortable. My hands are going to be separate. I'm going to make sure I'm reaching from the shoulders forward and down, so I don't want to let the bar around me. And now from here, I'm squeezing my hands as hard as I can. I want to reach long and I want to come up. And this is a fantastic exercise for cyclists because it allows you to also work on thoracic extension and learning what your shoulders are going to do that are going to essentially influence everything else in the rest of the chain. So the Zercher squats, not necessarily the most comfortable. Again, sweatshirt as opposed to the body bar or the pad. But if you want the pad, that's fine. It just makes it a little bit bigger, and you have to make sure you're reaching. So the Zercher squats, I really love. It's a great progression from the goblet squat when either we run out of kettlebells that someone has or a gym has, and they have barbells. But you've got to make sure that the bar is starting below. Just like everything, we always start with the bar a little bit lower than we need so we can stand. Same thing when we rack the bar, we want it to be a little bit lower. If you have racks like this, you got to make sure that you're not going to go forward and over that, but that's something to be concerned with the front squat and the back squat, which we'll discuss here coming up in the video. So the Zercher squats, not a lot of people know them. It's a fantastic exercise if you do it right. Great core control, great exercise, really loads the hips almost as good as a belt squat, which we don't have here. But that is your Zercher squat, and another, or our first in the series of barbells, that would be our top recommendations for cyclists to possibly use for squatting. All right, so the next, I guess we'll call it an advancement. I'm kind of taking you guys through a progression here of the different squat variations, and I'm doing that on purpose because as you go through this, it really should be a progression. We don't need barbells and super heavy weights to kick your butt and get you the results you need, right? Lift heavy stuff, it's really about how you're moving. Are you moving well? What's the RPE? What are you paying attention to? If you guys come in and work with me in here, I can almost guarantee you that I can kick your butt with a much lighter weight than you think you need in order to get the results. Now, the next progression here is going to be the landmine. So the landmine, there is a special apparatus, but I know a number of you have actually watched my video from 2017 on this and said, hey, I don't have that special piece. So let me show you what it looks like without the apparatus. We have a 20 kilo or 45 kilo plate on the floor. Then we just put the end of the barbell, the 20 kilo or 45 pound barbell into that, and that is our landmine apparatus. Now, there are special pieces that you can buy. So you have this right here. It essentially fits like a sleeve, and then it sits inside the the barbell, and it just makes it a little bit easier to move. So those are the two options. I'm going to use this because it gives me the ability to talk to you guys and have a peace of mind that the bar's not going to slip. Although usually when you're doing these, if you're doing them right, it's not going to happen. So the landmine squat is essentially going to be holding similar to the goblet squat, except now you have a different line of action. Now, if you're holding heavier, you'll want to take both hands one on top of the other. You can switch, you can do it the same. But again, we want to make sure we're reaching through the elbows, and the landmine is going to force us to sit back at an angle. So what this does, it allows me to get a little bit more anterior pelvic tilt. So I've got to use my obliques and my abs. I'm reaching long through the elbows. I'm going to take it down. I'm going to feel the weight shift back towards my heels and then come up. Now the hard part with this is not wanting to use not using the hands, even though you're going to want to. So it pushes us back into the hips a little bit more, and it comes up. So I tend to use this more with the goblet squatters who kind of come onto the toes. I like this because it teaches them to get a stretch on the glutes. It teaches you, as you come down, to feel those hips loading, as opposed to, because here, if I try and squat forward on my toes, I'm going to run out into the bar with my face, right? So it teaches you to sit back into the hips and to be able to push. It's a much more glute dominant squatting variation, but I tend to be very selective with when I use it. Of course, we can also put your feet up on blocks, or we can have you on the slant of 15 degree or 20 degree. I tend to be very selective with when I use that. These, again, great for those of you who are having a difficult time with the goblet squats, or you were really, fading forward. This is a fantastic go-to-between. As you can hear, it's really challenging. It is surprisingly challenging when you get it, because it's a different strategy in order to protect things and keep things moving well. So when you're doing this, it's really important to remember the weight should be against a wall, or you have another weight behind it so it's not sliding as you're going, and you really do not need to load these up that much. If you do it right, you're paying attention to keep your rib cage and pelvis locked, you're keeping the weight even on your feet, and you're loading the glutes as you come down. It really kicks your butt very quickly. You don't need a whole lot of repetitions, and it's a lot of fun. It's a great variation. So if you've been barbell squatting for a couple years and you're getting a little bored, you're looking for something different, or you just want to try something different, the landmine squats are absolutely fantastic. So you can give those a try. Now that's the first variation of the landmine squat. That's the high variation. The other variation is going to be like our earlier squat variation, and that's the potato sack squat variation. Now I tend to use this for the guys who go too far back into their hips. So if I want to teach them to stay a little bit more towards their toes, then we come straight down and straight up. Now, what's the difference between this and the potato sack squat we saw earlier? It allows me to put more load on them, and it decreases the range of motion. So now I'm starting to get them to differentiate between a hinge and a squat, and they're gonna run out of space depending on the size of the weight plate I put on. So if I have a standard Olympic bumper plate on here, that's about as far as I can go. So we're not worried about full range of motion and getting all the way down to the ground, but we are trying to get you to learn, how do I keep the system stacked? How do I keep my abs active? And how do I keep the weight even on my foot as I'm coming down? And then from here, then we can progress to one of the other variations further on. So if you tend to float forward when you're doing your squats, we do the high variation. If you tend to float backward during your goblet squats, we do the low variation. This again, it comes back to the whole comparison of what type of knife do you need? Do you need a Swiss Army knife? Do you need a butcher knife? Do you need a machete? The right tool for the job is going to get you better results than just blowing through and doing a barbell back squat or front squat. So this is the landmine variation, and the two variations of those depending on what your personal challenges are. All right, so the squat variation that I found over the years, almost a decade and a half, or a little bit more than a decade and a half, to be most beneficial for cyclists after the goblet squat is actually going to be a barbell front squat. Now, this is something that I had to really relearn and rewire my brain, because I came from a powerlifting background. I was a competitive powerlifter, natural, no drugs or anything, and I was pretty darn good at it. But learning the front squat is a completely different skill set, and it's how that squat is executed that I have found actually serves cyclists and triathletes much more than the back squat. Again, it depends on your anatomy, where your hips are, and how your chosen movement patterns are working. But this is one that I found over and over again, and in fact, with the national team here, we almost exclusively do front squats. So there's three reasons why most cyclists and triathletes will avoid this. Number one is the obvious. If they don't have the range of motion in through the shoulders, and they don't have the core control, the ability to keep the rib cage down and the elbows up. And this is actually one of the main big benefits, is it's teaching you to be able to keep a good trunk posture, that canister position here, as opposed to scissoring when you have your hands out in front of you. So if you think about this and we take you down into a riding position, it's pretty gosh darn similar. Now on top of that, being in this position, if you have shoulders that aren't working that well, we can get the serratus anterior muscles to begin to reach. And remember, we talked about that with the goblet squat a little bit. So working on this is getting your glutes to work better, because the glutes, the obliques, and the serratus anterior all work together to create one system for stability. And this is really important when it comes to power production on the bike, especially if you're climbing or sprinting or at an FTP effort trying to drop the hammer. And this is really, really useful for most cyclists. So the way that we get into this, and this is reason number 2 that most cyclists don't do it, is they don't understand the hand position. They try and go with full hands. They think they have to hold on to the bar. And if you look at that, and then I put it on my collarbone, it's not that comfortable. My elbows want to drop, and then I wind up almost doing like a shoulder press here, as opposed to what we actually want. And that is to use a little bit of what's called a lobster grip, which is where we have the index finger and the middle finger are going to be around the bar, which frees up and gives us actually more mobility in through the wrist. So if you look at it here, I don't have a lot of mobility through the wrist. As soon as I take the ring finger and the pinky underneath, my elbow could come higher, because what we've done is we've taken tension off of the system, the small muscles that help us to flex the ring finger and the pinky finger, and we've created more space. It's also how they make the lobster gloves for winter riding, if you've ever used those, the windproof gloves. But once we get into this, a lot of it is just getting used to having that bar on your collarbone. And to me, and there's no science to back this up, this is purely anecdotal and just me thinking of the forces and how the bones adapt. When you have pressure on a bone, and the clavicle is unique because it doesn't really take any forward pressure unless we're on our hands and knees or down on the handlebars. To me, having that bar sit on top is creating mechanical stress, and the way bones adapt and get tougher is through mechanical stress. So to me, again, I don't have any real scientific evidence, but it's like, it would make sense if the bone gets a little bit tougher, which would be an added bonus. And if I'm wrong, I still like the front squats. Now, the last reason a lot of people don't do front squats is because it challenges you to actually create hip power and to move at the knee well. And this, again, is something that most cyclists need. So let's take a look at this. So here's my front squat. I'm gonna keep my elbows up. I have to keep my system stacked so my abs are engaged, sinking straight down, and then coming right back up. Now, what this does is allow me to have something that's a little bit more similar to cycling motion, in that it's a knee dominant movement, but it forces me to be able to get a stretch on the glutes while keeping the midsection in line, right? So the back squat, you kind of tend to sink back, and we see the arching of the back, and then we see the dumping of the pelvis forward or back, depending on what most cyclists are doing. So this is the front squat. This is where I honestly don't give a crap where you wind up. There are so many different options, as you've seen already up until we got here, that we can load you. And for 98% of you out there who are recreational cyclists or racing regionally and even nationally in the US, and depending on where you are in Europe, even nationally, we can get you there without ever taking you to the front squat. Now, at a certain point, I would like to move you there because of the complexity, the oddity of the bar. You have to move your body around the bar, and that adds a layer of movement learning, which I think is very beneficial. Now, here's 2 things that can help you to be able to front squat easier. If even that lobster grip doesn't quite get you there, we can use wrist straps. And this is really important to differentiate these. The wrist straps are used to help hold on to the bar. Most people think of them for deadlifting or rowing. And what we can do is we can actually take these and create little handles on the barbell itself, which makes it easier for you to hold. Now, if you don't have wrist straps, you don't got to go out and spend 20 bucks to get a pair. You can just use dish towels. And you do the same thing. You wrap the dish towel around, and it gives you something to hold on to, which makes it a lot easier to be able to stay in that position, because now you don't have to worry about the wrist at all. So I have to create pressure. It also allows people to decrease the load on the clavicle, on the collarbone, and then I can go through and do the exact same thing. So it's similar but different. Again, it's not going to be super comfortable. It's going to take some time to get used to, but this is another way we can make it more accessible to you. Now, one more thing, if you can get into the lobster grip, but you're finding that it's putting a lot of pressure onto your wrists, 2 things. One, we have to look at the shoulder function, which we already know for a lot of cyclists, the shoulder blade, the whole shoulder joint tends to be rounded forward and down. So it gets compacted. The clavicle is not moving quite well. It puts more pressure on the wrist and the elbow. This often leads to shoulder and neck tightness as we ride. So the other thing you can do is you can get wrist wraps. So wrist wraps are actually really useful. You'll see a lot of the big guys in the gym will use these, and they're actually pretty easy to use. They just wrap around here. We'll take my watch off. And what these do is they supply a little bit of support for the wrist. They take some of the tension off the tissues. You don't have to make it super tight. You'll see a lot of gymnasts will use this to take some of the pressure off, but it just supplies a little bit of support for the wrist as you're going through. And you don't even need to have these on with the thumbs if you don't want. And we can do the same thing with the lobster grip and come back. And when you have more weight on the bar, it just takes the pressure off the wrist. It doesn't let them take as much flexion and extension, excuse me. And what we also need to keep in mind there is it's possible that as you're coming down, you're letting the elbows drop and the bar is rolling forward, and that's where you're getting the pressure on the wrist. So again, it comes down to moving around an odd object. Now, why am I taking so long to explain each of these is because it's not the exercise itself, but it's understanding how do I adjust this to get what I need out of it. Because there are a number of cyclists out there who've told me flat out, I will never front squat. I'm never gonna do it. It's not comfortable, it's painful. And yet when we get them into one of these adaptations and we use the right piece of equipment, they go, wow, I feel so much better. It's only been 2 weeks, but I can feel the difference on the bike. And that's where strength training for performance comes from. So that's why we're going through so many different variations of the squat. Now let's go to the last one, which tends to be the first one that people think of, and that is the back squat. So the last one we're going to cover is what most people think of when they think of squatting, and that is with a barbell on your back, called a barbell back squat. Now the reason why most people think about this, it's the powerlifting competitive sport. And this is how a lot of people tend to think of squatting, because that's what we see a lot of, these big guys and gals lifting heavy weight on their backs. Now, I don't like the back squat for cyclists for a number of reasons. And a lot of it has to do with what we've covered already in the other variations of the squats. Very rarely will I use this with an athlete unless we see their hips and their spine move a certain way. And the reason is there's so many other ways we can squat with weight that will serve you. So let's take a look at why I don't really like this. And again, just because I don't like it doesn't mean that you can't use it. I'm just sharing with you what I found over the last 27 years of being in and around health and fitness, and the last 15 years working mostly or primarily with cyclists and triathletes. When we come to the barbell back squat, a lot of us as cyclists tend not to have the shoulder range of motion. Our shoulders tend to get stuck. So we like to kind of do this. And if you notice, that pushes me into a forward or kyphotic curvature of my upper back, something that's comfortable for us because of all the amount of riding that we do. But really, in order to back squat well, you need to keep the system stacked. So you've got to keep your rib cage over your pelvis. You've got to keep the elbows under the bar and you're pulling the bar down with your lats. And only then can we get down into a squat and be able to move from there. But a lot of cyclists, the bar is going to be high. They're kind of pushing the elbows, the back forward. They're rounding the back forward, pushing their center of gravity forward. And then as they come down, they're kind of rounding here and they're not able to keep a neutral spine. Or at the top, if they can keep a fairly neutral spine, they get into this excessive pelvic tilt at the top because they think they need to push. And because they're so quad dominant, it's really not allowing the hips to be in a good position. So the back squat can be a good variation, but there's so many different things that we can do that are better, in my opinion, options, right? It's all about options. And what we're trying to do for you is give you the best options available to allow you to see performance gains. We're not talking about being the heaviest squatter in the weight room. We're talking about being able to squat heavy enough based off of an RPE with good, high quality technique, which is where you'll actually carry the power and strength over to the bike. And that's really what a lot of people are missing these days with the strength training, and they're trying to push max weight. They're not looking at what is the best tool. Right? It's kind of coming back to that comparison we had at the beginning of the video. It's like having a Swiss Army knife versus having a camping knife. We want to be able to choose the right tool that will actually fit your needs.